Okay, so the Liberian Civil War started, following in 1980 a coup conducted by a man called Samuel Doe. Okay, he became the president of Liberia, and he was ruling. And then there is this guy called Charles Taylor in that government. Okay, Charles Taylor held a high-ranking position in that government. Okay, this was happening in the 80s, and then by 1983, Charles Taylor left his position and left the country. And then Charles Taylor was accused of embezzlement by Samuel Doe's government. Okay, he was accused of embezzlement. He was arrested in the US and he was detained. But then somehow this was happening in 1983, right? That's when Charles Taylor left his office. He was accused of embezzling over $900,000 in those days, a huge amount of money. And then somehow he slipped the hands of the US government, and by 1985, he was back in Cote d'Ivoire, another country in West Africa. He was back in Cote d'Ivoire, and he started training some people. Okay, he started training some forces from 1985 until 1989. And then finally, on the 24th of December of 1989, Charles Taylor invaded a part of Liberia. Okay, now Charles Taylor, between 1985 to 1989, he has trained and groomed forces that he organized, and he called them the NPFL, the National Patriotic Front of Liberia. Okay, he has trained the people that he called the NPFL, and with these people, he invaded Liberia, and then thus signaling the beginning of the Civil War. And then this war continued, and it lasted for years. And by 1997, during the Abuja Agreement, after the Abuja Agreement, that's when they had a final ceasefire. But then Samuel Doe, who was the leader of the government, he was the leader of the government in those days between 1989 until he died in 1990. And then when the war was going on, the federal forces, they began to fight the rebels who were the NPFL. But the NPFL were armed very well to the teeth. They were well armed, and the fighting broke out. And then it's happened that somewhere in July of 1990, the war started in 89, and by 1990, something happened to the NPFL. There was this guy, another leader of the NPFL hierarchy called Prince Johnson. Okay, Prince Johnson is of the military, and then what really happened was that the NPFL had to split into two. Okay, Charles Taylor led the NPFL, but the NPFL split into two, and then Prince Johnson became the second leader of the second faction that came out from NPFL. These people called themselves the INPFL, the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia. Okay, so this guy became the leader of the INPFL. Now, these two factions has the same objective, that is removing Samuel Doe from power. But somehow, both of them couldn't agree with both of them. And then the war continued on until September of 1990, when Samuel Doe, who was the president of Liberia then, was reportedly visiting an ECOMOG, headquarters in the country, because ECOMOG was the military force that came from ECOWAS, and they were just there for the peace. They were just there to broker peace between the rebels and the federal forces. And then, but what really happened was that while visiting the ECOMOG headquarters, something happened to Samuel Doe, information leaked out, and then Prince Johnson and his people had to attack Samuel Doe where he was, and then he was captured alive. And then I can show you this video here, because the video of how he was spied, the video of how he was, he was unalived, was all recorded. It was videotaped. There were cameras on, they were recording the torture, and they were recording everything. I can show you this video here. Okay. So what really happened was that he was reportedly tortured, and he was reportedly unalived in September of 1990. But now that the head of the federal government is gone, the war did not end. What really happened was that Charles Taylor and Prince Johnson, both of them began to, fight for the capital city of Monrovia. They began to fight for the capital city, who was going to take over the capital city, because it was assumed that whoever controlled the capital city controls the country. But then there is ECOMOG, the forces of ECOWAS, the ECOMOG forces were drawn from many countries of West Africa under ECOWAS, and they were called ECOMOG. And then they were still there on the ground, and they don't want anybody they don't want any of the rebel forces to occupy Monrovia. What they actually wanted was very simple: for them to keep the peace, install an interim government that is going to oversee the elections that is going to happen. But somehow these two warlords, Prince Johnson and Charles Taylor, are constantly fighting for Monrovia. And then the war went on throughout 90s, the 1991, 1992. There were some minor peace deals that were done, like the Cotonou peace deal, like the Benin Republic peace deal. These things happened over time. In 92, the war continued, 93, 94, 95, 96, until finally in 1997, they signed a final peace agreement called the Abuja Agreement, and then the hostilities ceased, and then they were able to conduct elections, signaling the end of the first civil war in Liberia. Know your history. Let me come and be going.